I call this meeting to order and welcome to meeting number 17 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. I'll start by acknowledging that I am meeting here on Treaty 1 territory in the home of the Métis Nation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10th, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings. Members and witnesses participating virtually may speak in the official language of your choice. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. The committee clerk will advise the chair on whose hands are up to the best of his ability, and we will do the best we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, brackets 2, and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, March 3rd, 2022, the committee is commencing its study of the assessment of Canada's security posture in relation to Russia. With us today by video conference as an individual, Dr. James Ferguson, Deputy Director, Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Robert Hubert, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Calgary, and Dr. Veronica Kitchen, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Waterloo. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. So, welcome to all of you. I now invite Dr. Ferguson to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I wanted to begin my brief comments with the concern I have. And I think it's very important that the committee and the government does not overreact, if not go into panic with regards to existing vulnerabilities, both in the cyber and the defense world, to Canada from Russian capabilities. Certainly the war has heightened the attention, but as I would argue to you, these vulnerabilities have been here for a long time now. And we need to recognize, given the relationship, the adversarial relationship that exists between Russia and Canada, Russia and the West, that this is not a new Cold War. And there are other issues and other threats out there which have to be taken into account when trying to respond to the Russian side of this equation. In terms of the cyber world, I think what I would point out in my central concerns is primarily the question of whether the government, and particularly our relationship with the United States, as a function of economic integration and the integration of critical infrastructure, is structured properly to deal with the vulnerabilities that exist. There is no central agency, as in the defense world, in this case NORAD, to coordinate responses to potential Russian cyber attacks, whether they are for espionage reason or attempt to undermine or sabotage critical infrastructure. I think this is an important issue. NORAD for some time has sought or believed that it could be responsible for the cybersecurity world, cyber defense in North America. I still argue that this is very problematic. Some restructuring is necessary, I believe, particularly in the relationship with the United States. But this cyber world is a unique world from the defense world, not least of all because the critical infrastructure is by and large in the hands of the private sector. And private sector issues, of course, corporate issues with regards to threats have different dynamics and different concerns from the corporate side relative to government. And of course, this is not just the federal government, but this also includes the provincial government. In terms of disinformation, I'm not one who believes that Russian disinformation or Chinese or anyone's disinformation campaigns really have much of an effect at all. I think that's highly overblown and exaggerated. Espionage has been around, and that is a concern, but that's a concern to ensure that government and military cyber networks are closed and secure. Canada has no capacity except to deny access as best it can across the spectrum. We have no ability to retaliate in terms of a cyber retaliation. So I think we need to think about those things in particular. In the physical world, the defense world, would point out to the committee that for a long time, Russian strategic doctrine has been one of first use of nuclear weapons. The Russians have developed a new set of capabilities beyond their ballistic missile capacities. These are in the world of longer and longer range cruise missiles, in the future nuclear powered cruise missiles and hypersonic vehicles, all of which are nuclear and conventional capable. It's hard for defense, of course, to know what is coming, if it's coming. But we have significant gaps in vulnerabilities which have existed for over a decade in terms of the ability of NORAD, and as a result, Canada, to be able to detect these threats, to track them, to discriminate, and then to be able to cue interception capabilities. Interceptors are another issue. The F-35 is a step forward, but there's a broad need to rethink about the way Canada, in conjunction with the United States via NORAD, undertakes and modernizes North American defense to reduce our vulnerability and to be able to deter potential Russian threats, which will affect the way Canada and North America, the United States, respond to threats that originate overseas, as we see today in the Ukraine. I shall leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Dr. Hubert to make an opening comment of up to 5 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be asked here to contribute to this very important topic. In my 5 minutes, I have 5 points. The first point is that Russia is an existential threat to Canada, and it is growing. The second point is that we have either ignored or appeased Russia since the signs of the type of nature that we are dealing with, the type of threat which has developed since 2008. We're not talking about a threat that develops in February of 2022. We're not talking about one that develops in March of 2014, but one that clearly has been indicating to us what it means to Canada and what it means ultimately to Canadian security. Where this threat comes from is that Putin, the administration of Putin, sees an existential threat to his regime by the activities and the existence of NATO. NATO, of course, is the alliance in which Canada is a participant along with NORAD, which means that any conflict that involves NATO will involve Canada. Now, where does this threat come from? Well, there are two major elements that drive the Russian threat to Canada. The first one is that we have seen since Putin, even on his first days as acting president in 1999, moves to reconsolidate the Russian Empire. Now, what do I mean by this? One of the very first steps that he takes on as acting president is to intensify the war in Chechnya, in which the Russians had come close to losing in 1994 and were subsequently successful in being able to put down the moves for secession. We see a series of military moves to expand Russian control, starting, of course, Chechnya, then Georgia, and then, of course, when the Ukrainian war actually starts, which is 2014. So we see that there is this effort. The second part is the protection of the regime. Once again, we have tended to ignore the threat, but we see the manner in which the Russian regime has moved against any opposition within, and even those of opposition that are physically outside of Russia. Perhaps the most important element of this threat that Canada has, in fact, been ignoring is the Russian way of war and the willingness to use that way of war to achieve its policy objectives, which places it on a direct collision course with NATO. Now, when we talk about Russia, there are at least 3 levels to their multi-domain processes of warfare. The first one, of course, and Dr. Ferguson touched on it, is, of course, the existence of the Russian commitment to use of tactical nuclear war. We've tended to pretend that after the initiations under the Gorbachev regime of significant arms control movements, that this was a thing of the past. The reality is, in terms of Russian doctrine, in terms of Russian force projection, in terms of Russian force delivery. We see that they, in fact, are modernizing their tactical capability. We see, of course, the threat that Putin gave to utilize nuclear weapons. And this illustrates and is further amplified by the Russian commitment to also learn how to blind NATO countries. We have seen, of course, the demonstration effect in which the Russians demonstrated how they can shoot down one of their own satellites with their missile capability. And in February this year, they demonstrated how they can cut cables and hence communications. All of this points to a very concrete tactic, if indeed that they feel it necessary to use nuclear war, that nuclear weapons, that of course that we would be involved. They also, of course, have demonstrated a very strong willingness to engage in conventional war, and means that I'm afraid that we do not have a full appreciation. Some of the evaluations coming out of this phase of the Ukrainian crisis illustrates we did not pay attention to the Georgian war and the Chechnya war and the Syrian war. Cyber warfare, Dr. Ferguson has already touched upon it. I am more concerned about the weaponization of social media. I do think that the Russians, in terms of some of the evidence that our Americans and British allies have shown, are of course problematic. So ultimately, we are facing a threat from Russia. It is growing, and it is reaching the level of an existential crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now invite Dr. Kitchen to take the floor and give up to 5 minutes of an opening statement. Floor is yours, Dr. Kitchen.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the kind invitation to speak to you today on the topic of Canada's emergency preparedness for threats posed by Russia. My remarks today draw on a career studying Canadian security in a global context, and specifically on the work I've done with the Canadian Association for Terrorism, Security and Society, and as co-director for North American Security in the Defense and Security Foresight Group. The threat to Canada is exacerbated by Russia's clear desperation. Missiles over the Canadian Arctic or the use of weapons of mass destruction look more likely than they did a few months ago, even accounting for the fact that Russia is clearly preoccupied by its invasion of Ukraine not going as it expected. This may mean that the prospects for widening its targets to include Canada or NATO allies may be smaller in the short term, but possibly only the very short term. What are the most immediate threats? My colleagues have already discussed some of the military threats, and I want to focus on some of the immediate but more indirect threats to Canadian public safety. Russia's disinformation campaign has been hindered by sanctions that have removed Russian media from our airwaves, but they are still prevalent on social media and in forums frequented by adherents of other kinds of populist conspiracy. The weapon of disinformation is not going away. And one of the lessons of sanctions research is that sanctions become less effective over time. So we should expect this to be an ongoing threat from Russia. Canada is a target as a member of NATO, but also as a longstanding supporter of Ukraine, as personified in the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. Russian disinformation campaigns connect the invasion of Ukraine to QAnon and other deep state conspiracy theories that feed hate crimes and distrust of the Canadian government. A concrete example are the recent QAnon claims that President Putin endorsed the sovereign authority of Ramona Didulo, the self-styled Queen of Canada QAnon adherent. The attractiveness of conspiracy theories has been increased by the COVID-19 pandemic and will be increased even more by Russian misinformation, whether targeted directly at Canada or not. Certainly, there's a risk that these adherents of these conspiracy theories will commit violent acts. But the political action of supporters of populist extremism can also have harmful effects that don't escalate to the level of security threat or crime. We saw examples of this in the recent trucker convoy in Ottawa, where traffic prevented ambulances from leaving downtown, and convoy supporters flooded the 911 system with calls. And I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting that the trucker convoy was a product of Russian misinformation, because I don't think we know that. But these are examples of the kinds of effects that are threats to human security exacerbated by Russian disinformation that we're not used to dealing with in the context of security and law. And the good news is that only a narrow swath of Canadians will be attracted to these ideas and influenced by Russian misinformation. But the bad news is that their effects are easily amplified by bots and the solutions may be long-term. Media literacy can help in some instances, but in many cases, the disinformation will be too sophisticated to educate ourselves out of. Working with private companies, as has already been mentioned, and our allies to improve our technological responses to disinformation is essential. The recent creation of the Advisory Group on Online Hate is a step in the right direction, as is the Security and Intelligence Threat to Elections Task Force, which some have suggested should have a role election now. We also need to find ways to turn down the temperature on social polarization caused in part by human insecurity and exacerbated by the necessity for global action against Russia. Examples include increasing fuel and food prices, but reinforcing trust in institutions through transparency, reform, and cultural change also have a role. We should not underestimate the ways in which Russia's actions have affected Canada's security by destabilizing the world. Russia has undermined the United Nations, committed war crimes, generated massive flows of refugees, and threatened our borders and our allies. Canada is less secure in a world where international law is not respected. It is easy to be overwhelmed by the scale of the threat when we're talking about everything from a potential nuclear attack to hate crimes. Foreign policy and domestic security are linked. Working to protect Canada from the most direct threats, from missiles to misinformation, and contributing to end the war are obviously imperative. Welcoming refugees and ensuring that social services that help them are adequately resourced is important, but so too is ensuring that there's a perception that refugees from other conflicts are treated equitably, because not doing so contributes to mistrust in government.
Thank you. 10 seconds, please.
The need to provide military aid or come to the defense of our NATO allies in Europe stretches our military and forces choices about how to use it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Apologies again, fair world. Thanks to the witnesses for those opening remarks. We'll now move into the first round of questions from members of the committee. And I'll start with Ms. Dancho. You have 6 minutes. The floor is yours, Ms. Dancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our expert witnesses for sharing your very critical and important testimony today. My first question will be to Professor Ferguson, fellow Manitoban. Thank you again, Professor, for being here. I would like your thoughts on, we've been talking a lot in the last few months about modernizing NORAD and the North Early Warning System. Can you explain why it's important that we modernize those systems and how we go about doing so?
Well, the first answer is we're vulnerable. The North Warning System is out of date, and in fact, it's too limited to deal with the 360-degree threats environment that North America faces. The government tends to talk about NORAD modernization equaling North Warning System modernization. It's much bigger than that. It's about North American defense modernization. Developing a group of new sets of sensors, both land, sea, air, and space-based. Developing the computer capabilities, the processing analytical capabilities to be able to integrate an all-domain defense requirement. The F-35 is an important step forward, but it's only one step of thinking about the need for a much more complicated, complex, layered defense capability, one that has to move further north. All these are major issues when we talk about dealing with the vulnerabilities that Canada faces in conjunction with our close ally, the United States, in trying to ensure that our deterrent, the Western deterrent, the US-led deterrent, global deterrent, is not undermined because of vulnerability at home. That adversaries, potentially like Russia, can hold Canadian populations as hostage, which will then reduce the willingness of governments in Canada and elsewhere to respond to deter these threats overseas. And those are the two key elements in my mind.
Mm-hmm. My understanding right now, and you'd mentioned this when you'd said, I think your comment just now was that for a U.S.-led deterrent, it should not be undermined by any vulnerabilities in Canada. And my understanding is right now with advanced weapons technology, hypersonic missiles of Russia, we wouldn't even be able to detect any incoming missile threat given our outdated system. Is that accurate? Is that the type of sort of undermining and vulnerability we have in Canada?
Certainly. The North Warning System has no capacity to be able to detect a hypersonic flying over the Arctic region, heading towards targets in the south. The American Ballistic Missile Early Warning System is optimized to deal with long-range ballistic missiles, not hypersonics. So you have a major gap there. Moreover, the North Warning System has a great difficult time. It can briefly detect potentially cruise missiles in flight, but because of the long range, they'll be launched well over the Arctic Ocean. That is another important detection gap we have. And if we can't detect, we can't deter, and we can't defend.
Do we have adequate sort of information sharing between, say, transport, the Canadian Armed Forces, any northern agencies? Do we have adequate sort of Arctic coordination between departments currently? And do you see that as an issue?
I think that's an important issue. Right now, it's more or less ad hoc, depending on the specific issues that emerge, particularly in the Arctic. The government of Canada, if you ask the question, who's responsible at the bureaucratic level for the Arctic? The answer is everyone, and if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. So government needs to rethink about how it's going to organize to ensure that the various agencies, and this ranges from the Defense Department to Transport Canada, Coast Guard, Health, Industry, et cetera, they're all foreign affairs, they're all got a sort of a piece of the pie. And that needs to be seriously looked at. And I understand government never likes to do this big reorganization, but we have to remember we are structured for a world that no longer exists anymore with the Arctic as a function of climate change. So this coordination and cooperation needs to be developed quickly.
So in essence, you would recommend that there should be a central sort of agency responsible for Arctic defense, and there is not currently one of those.
Exactly.
Yes.
I would call it essential for Arctic security.
Okay.
With defense as a component.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just, I have about a minute and a half left. Professor Hubert, if you'd like to just top up anything that Professor Ferguson has said, you're welcome to conclude with my minute and a half left.
Well, the one area that Dr. Ferguson didn't have time to talk about is, of course, the maritime dimension of the approaches. He's talked very correctly about the hypersonics, but we know that the Russian submarine activity has been increasing. We know that their deep diving capabilities are increasing. We've seen how they can do the cable, and NORAD does have their mandate to deal with the undersea threat, but that is one area that we are really weak. The Russians have even developed underwater autonomous vehicles that can go allegedly 10,000 miles and carry a nuclear warhead. And once again, these are all elements of the overall domain type of warfare that Russia now brings to the table that we ultimately and completely need to be able to detect and, as Dr. Ferguson said, respond to.
25 seconds. Do you have anything else to add of the critical importance of building our defenses and where we should be focusing our efforts, for example, in the upcoming budget?
It's, first of all, we have to make sure that we are getting that domain awareness. It's a 360 threat that is now. That means the entire entity of Canada is a threat to these new weapon systems. If the Russians believe that they have an advantage, that we can't detect, that we can't respond, we see the lengths of which they go in the engagement of the achievement of their objectives. And that puts us very vulnerable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to invite Mr. Chang to begin a 6-minute block. Mr. Chang, the floor is yours, sir. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses today for participating in this important study that we're doing. My question is for Dr. Ferguson. What are some strategic geographic advantage that Canada enjoys related to national security, and how can we use these advantages to our benefits? Dr. Ferguson?
Forgot to unmute. The answer is twofold. We enjoy the strategic advantage of geography, which constrains the threats, the military threats, the defense threats to North America, to the aerospace realm. It can be maritime as a function of maritime launch capabilities, but basically we can focus our attention in that. The second big strategic advantage we have as a function of geography is we sit beside the United States, a global superpower with the capabilities across the board to lead the global deterrent against not just Russia, but any other threats that emerge of importance to Canada. And we benefit, of course, in our relationship with the United States by American support, the provision of American capabilities, American funding support to modernization on a 60% basis for infrastructure in Canada. All those work in our favor, while at the same time providing us with access to American information, access to American planning to ensure that Canadian interests are taken into account in the construct of NORAD as a binational command.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer on that. Based on your comments, is there something we can improve in terms of our partnership with the Americans, and can the Americans improve the NORAD system, or is that a joint venture?
Well, it's a joint venture, and importantly, the issues surrounding NORAD modernization, which is North American defense modernization, NORAD is the driver behind it. They are the planning center right now, which will start to move requirements forward over hopefully the near term. In terms of processing information, because that is centralized in NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs, that's by and large American. And that, I would note, is what's known as their Pathfinder initiative, which is going to try to deal with, through the use of artificial intelligence, the massive amounts of data that are going to pour in from the sensor system. So that's part of it. But the key thing for me is, because of the nature of the changing threat environment, the origins, the platforms relative to the missiles, I think it's time Canada and the United States sat down and start to seriously think about a functional, integrated North American Defense Command. We have close bilateral defense cooperation with the United States in the maritime and the land sectors. But I think because of the nature of the all-domain environment, we need to take the step which we took in 1957-58 for the air world. We now need to move it into a true integrated North American Defense Command.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Hubert, could you expand on some of the cybersecurity threats that Russia poses to Canada, and some of the measures that are needed to address these threats?
Absolutely. What we're seeing and what we can see from some of the open reports, the Americans, of course, have had to deal with the interference that they had in regards to the 2016 election. The British House of Commons committee examined what happened in terms of Russian interference in the Brexit. And there have been studies in terms of the Russian interference of the Castilian independence movement in Spain. And so what we are seeing, or at least what seems to be appearing, and this is something, of course, of Dr. Kitchen's expertise as well, is that we see a focusing on areas where the society can be divided. And this is what, of course, everybody refers to when they talk about the social weaponization of social media. And I think what the Russians have discovered, and we can't leave the Chinese because the Chinese are also heavily involved, or at least that is what it comes out of the open literature, is that they try to divide the societies by focusing on the various feeds that exist. And this is then followed by what they hope that somebody within that society will pick up that cause and become the leader. Sort of the issue that Lenin referred to back in the early days of communism, useful idiots, that basically try to act to divide the society. And so that we see the effort to actually have a way of separating and neutralizing any support for the type of collective actions that we need. In terms of other cyber threats, we also know that the Russians have shown an increasing capability of being able to interfere with the various electronic systems, cyber systems of other states. We've seen this in terms of their ability to influence the Ukrainian electrical system prior to the onset of the war in 2014. We're seeing this in other locations, but once again, it's hard to know exactly how well defended we come in terms of being able to harden that part of the cyber warfare. But there's no question whatsoever that the attention that the Russians and the Chinese are giving is increasing if the reports from the Americans and British are indications of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Ms. Michaud to begin her 6-minute block of questioning Ms. Michaud, whenever you're ready.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming. Your presentations are much appreciated. We have good reasons to be worried. Dr. Kitchen, I'll begin with you. You talked about the indirect threats, disinformation, the use of social media, and phishing campaigns or ransomware campaigns. There's the Sept-Îles refinery, which was hit by software ransoming. And the end of February, the group claimed responsibility for the attack, saying that they wanted to get 20% of the proceeds of the refinery. And this was directly tied to the sanctions against Russia. So we hear about this type of attack occurring. We hear about how our businesses are being hit, our critical infrastructure, etc. So what can we do to protect ourselves from this? How do we deal with this type of threat?
I think that there are many levels to this. There is a level at which individuals need to take personal responsibility for their making sure they're using things like two-factor authentication to protect their own systems, and obviously that applies at the level of organizations as well. And then from a governmental perspective, it is really, as has already been discussed, this question of cooperating both between the private sector and public authorities, but then also across borders, recognizing that these kinds of threats are not easily contained within domestic borders because of the transnational nature of both of the companies and of the groups. As Dr. Hubert already mentioned, there is this effort in disinformation to inspire others to take action rather than taking action directly. And so that's one of the ways where you can see this cross over from the cyber into the physical world. Certainly making sure that the kinds of software that run big systems like refineries are up to date and are protected from the internet is also very important.
There's a company that provided monitoring services for employees. Further to this, this is a business that offered this to its employees out of good faith, but this was acting after the fact. And what can the government do to protect businesses upstream? And what about these ransoms, these claims from groups that want to hurt us? How can groups come back? These groups can sometimes come back and ask for a second ransom. Is there any type of monitoring service that's provided to businesses that will help Canadians, to your knowledge?
I'm certainly not an expert on ransomware attacks and on cyber attacks of that nature. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of any specific services that might be offered. But again, certainly trying to stop vulnerabilities before they happen. And I think that the government can have a role in providing information of the kinds of threats that might be faced, and on the side of sort of disinformation, of providing accurate information in order to help combat the tendency to be taken in by things like phishing scams and ransomware attacks could be helpful.
Thank you. Professor Ferguson, would you like to add to this issue? Because you're specialized in defense. I don't know if, to your knowledge, if you're aware of what type of services the governments could offer, or if they do offer any services to protect our institutions and business from this type of attack. I believe you're on mute, Professor Ferguson.
I can't respond specifically. I'm like Professor Kitchen in terms of my ability to answer these details. I think the key agency in terms of being able to provide information on notification is probably the Canadian Security Establishment, CSC. But I don't know in detail how much they have moved in this area because their work has always been on dealing with the electronic world. I think one of the dangers here, and I agree with Professor Kitchen about this is information. One of the dangers here is stepping over the line into the government trying to regulate, trying to force on private companies certain procedures, certain systems. You can imagine a central system, and that's going to be problematic because of the private sector issues involved. So there care needs to be taken here.
Alors, ce que vous dites,
You
c'est
still
pas
have 20 seconds.
Merci.
20 seconds.
Donc, pas nécessaire.
But not to impose a service, but perhaps offer it to people so that companies themselves can set up services to protect their citizens or their employees.
You get the last word on this, Ms. Michaud. So now I will move to Mr. McGregor. Sir, you have a 6-minute slot. The floor is yours whenever you want to grab it.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll echo my colleagues in thanking the witnesses for helping inform our committee study into this very important and very interesting subject. Dr. Ferguson, I'd like to start with you. Our committee's mandate is specifically to review legislation, policies, and programs for government departments that are responsible for public safety and national security. So I want to keep it focused really on our internal security and efforts. And in your opening statement, I think I was taking notes, you made mention of the fact that there is no central agency to respond to cyber attacks. Some restructuring may be necessary. I know in the United States there's an alphabet soup of different security and intelligence agencies that to various extents have capabilities to investigate cyber attacks. And here in Canada, the RCMP, CSIS, and CSE also have their capabilities. I would like to invite you to expand upon those remarks. Are you talking about more American-Canadian cooperation into an agency to take care of North American cybersecurity?
I wouldn't necessarily. Oh, damn it! Oh, I am on. I wouldn't necessarily call that we need an agency, but we certainly need a structure with the United States. And remember, the United States is structured differently. All those agencies you're talking about all live in one house, the Department of Homeland Security. So they are a bit of a step ahead of us, whereas, I mean, if you look at us, RCMP are dealing with criminal activities, and a lot of ransomware is about crime, or they're out to make money. CSE is on the intelligence side, as CSIS is, to be coordinated under public safety. Does public safety have the authority, and what are its links to Homeland Security in the United States? Are there regular meetings? Is there a bilateral committee? And you can think about variety of forums, for example, in the maritime warning world, where there is these developments, not just with the United States, but also with the Five Eyes community. Those things I think are important to look at in detail. Are we structured right? And particularly because in the internet cyber world, that world knows no borders. Information coming into Canada comes into the United States. It flows in patterns I don't know about or understand really. And critical infrastructure is integrated with the United States. So we have a common interest as a function of our close relationship of integration with the United States.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Kitchen, I'd like to move to you. Thank you for your remarks informing our committee about, the disinformation campaigns. Some of the narratives concerning Russian aggression that are coming out of some of the elements of the United States Republican Party and even some news organizations like Fox News have certainly raised some eyebrows. And we do have the American midterms coming up. There could be a shift in how the United States Congress is governed following those midterms. Do we, as a country, considering how successful some of the disinformation campaigns have been in the United States, do we, as a country, need to sort of closely examine what the potential pitfalls from that disinformation campaign in the United States are?
Certainly. So there's a few different ways to think about this. One is the effect that it might have on swaying an American election, both in the sense of whether there might be Russian interference, but also just broadly in what direction the American people will decide to vote, because certainly some administrations and some policy positions will be easier for Canada to deal with than for others. The other thing to be concerned about is the fact that individuals inspired by these kinds of narratives to take political action, whether it rises to the level of criminal activity or security activity, could happen on either side of the border. The media landscape in Canada and the United States is very closely integrated, which is not to say that there aren't separate causes in both countries, but we do see groups being inspired by each other across the border, and also groups that simply exist transnationally who might take action. So for Canada to sort of maintain and diversify our relations with the United States can help to make sure that our interests continue to be heard, even if we have a change in government.
Thank you. And final question to Dr. Hubert. Is there anything that we as a committee should be examining or making recommendations to the Canadian government on with respect to Russian involvement in financial crimes in Canada, money laundering, et cetera? Is there anything that you might be able to inform the committee on that particular subject?
It goes beyond Russian involvement. It goes into international crime, and we suspect also that the Chinese involvement is, of course, the issue of transparency. One of the difficulties we've always had in terms of being able to determine just exactly what the involvement of others are in the financial system is it's very hard to trace, both in terms of any regulatory regime and any government action. And if I have any sort of overall statement on that, it has to have some greater visibility in terms of what the transactions are and a move away from the privacy that often protects these type of actions.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, that completes the first round of questioning. A quick look at the clock tells me that if I cut everybody's time in half in the second round, we'll finish more or less on time. So to begin, I would ask Mr. Lloyd to give us 2.5 minutes. Floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My first question to Dr. Ferguson, considering the misinformation campaign, some people have been calling for censorship. Do you think that would backfire if the government were to engage in censorship?
Definitely it's going to backfire. As I've said, I don't agree that disinformation campaigns, and they're not all coming from Russia, and issues about our information campaigns as well, has that much of a significant impact in terms of exploiting social differences.
Thank you. I've always felt that the best way to fight misinformation is to fight with true information. So I'd ask the same question to Dr. Kitchen. Do you think that it would be more effective to fight misinformation with a vigorous campaign of putting forward true information, or do you think censorship would be effective, or would it backfire?
I think certainly providing true information is always a good strategy, but for true information to be effective, it has to come from institutions that people trust. And so maintaining that trust in institutions through transparency, as Dr. Hubert mentioned, is vitally important.
And would censorship undermine trust in those institutions, you think?
Quite possibly.
Thank you. And with my remaining 1 minute or so, I'm just amazed. North America, we have such a superiority in information technology. Obviously, got to work on improving that. Militarily, with our allies, we have tremendous. This is for Dr. Ferguson. We have also tremendous superiority. I'm amazed to see, the footage out of Ukraine. Their superior technology being shot down by relatively cheap technology like manpads and javelins. Wondering though, the missing piece, economic security. It seems like we have a gaping hole when Europe is completely dependent upon oil and gas from Russia and copper and palladium. What do you think the government could have been doing better for the last 20 years in this country, multiple governments, to address that economic insecurity?
I don't know if there's much the government could have done. And remember, we're living in a world of globalization, and this is the downside of globalization. And it's not just about Russian resources being provided to the Europeans, but how that whole international marketplace is structured and works out. Certainly, we could have been more aware of the potential, and I don't think a great deal of attention has been played because we tend to see globalization as good in economic terms,
Thank
but
you.
we didn't pay attention to security.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. McKinnon to take the floor for 2.5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Dr. Ferguson. In our world, of course, we're becoming ever more and more interconnected electronically. You know, that includes domestic, international communications, and our messages go to get from A to B, they end up getting routed all over the place in between. The core functionality that makes us secure is encryption. And one of the key aspects of encryption is at some point there will be asymmetric encryption involved there. And we know about asymmetric encryption that we have a public part of it and a secret part of it. And we know that the secret part can be brute forced if the adversary has enough time and willingness to do so. So with state actors such as Russia, China, and so forth, they have possession of massive computing facilities with massively parallel processing. So I'm wondering what we can do to protect to change our communications infrastructure, to protect our communications security, and our encryption. That's a big question, and if you've got a minute and a half.
I can only comment in terms of the defense side, and keeping closed, highly encrypted, most advanced encrypted systems in the intelligence and in the defense world. I'm not sure, and again, it's not necessarily the case that government or defense is going to let anyone know when they get hacked and they actually penetrate in these systems. But this is an interactive process because, not so much for Canada, but certainly for our allies besides the United States, there's also always the capability that we retaliate. This is nothing new. This is what we used to call electronic and counter-electronic warfare. This is something that's gone on. It's become more sophisticated. It's become quicker because of the nature of the technological pace and the changes that have occurred. There's no 100% guarantee, but certainly ensuring that you know when you get hacked is the most important thing. And the biggest danger is not that is the hacking, is the implanting of viruses such as the one planted in the Iranian nuclear system years ago.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would now like to invite Ms. Michaud to take 1 minute and 15 seconds. Make the best of it.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Professor Hubert, at the risk of asking you to repeat yourself with respect to cybersecurity, we know how Canada is prepared to deal with the worst-case scenarios, whether these threats come from Russia or some other country. Do you believe that we're ready? And if not, what should the government's priorities be?
We never know if we're ready. At the University of Calgary, we were hacked with a ransomware. Even though we have computer science, we have individuals that do. We weren't prepared for that when, in fact, that our entire computer system was shut down. And so part of the problem is that until we know the level of what's coming in, what that requires is a very well-funded counter cyber warfare capability. So be it the CRC, be it whoever you're giving it to, it's that grungy day-to-day, make sure that you've got the best computer analysts that are able to look at it and constantly be reevaluating. It's dull. It can't be shared. So people like me and Dr. Kitchen and Ferguson won't know how well or weak it is.
Thank
but
you.
It's something that the government needs to be totally on top of.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor, you have 75 precious seconds. Go for it.
Thank you. Very quickly to Dr. Kitchen. Just on the disinformation subject, there's been a lot of parallels between this study and our study into ideologically motivated violent extremism and the way, major companies, social media companies, companies like Amazon can be exploited using their algorithms and even in some cases like Amazon using their platforms to sell hateful propaganda. So the potential exists for a determined state actor to take advantage of that, if not through censorship. I mean, I think there's an argument to be made to remove untrue information. In what ways can the Canadian government effectively make sure that social media companies are not going to be vulnerable to these types of attacks?
I think this is where possibly regulation does become helpful, is regulation to make sure that we're getting rid of bots, making sure that we're getting rid of things that act automatically, and working together with those companies who are open to the idea of trying to control extremism, many of them on their platforms, is important. But it's also important to recognize that there are a whole series of secondary platforms where this kind of misinformation spreads that are a little more underground and less willing to work with governments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Shipley, I'll now turn to you for 2.5 minutes of questioning, sir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here today. I'd like to direct my first question both towards Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Hubert. I was trying to frantically take notes as both of you were talking. I was finding it very interesting, very informative. But and we don't have time to have an open floor debate here for a long time, but I'd like to have answers on both of these from both of you, please. Mr. Ferguson, you stated that disinformation is overblown and exaggerated and doesn't pose a real threat. This is as close to your quote as I could scribble at the time. And Mr. Hubert, I took from you that some of your quotes where you were very concerned about Russian social media and the weaponization of social media. So I'm sensing a bit of a difference there. If I could just get maybe some clarification, firstly from Mr. Ferguson on the threat as seen by that, and then Mr. Hubert after that, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, my answer to that is simply the lack of confidence and trust in the public. You're certainly going to have small proportions, as Professor Kitchen pointed out, of extremists who can be manipulated, but they're already fertile ground to be manipulated. If you look at the overarching component of the public, who are more involved in this than I am, I think we can trust them. I think they understand when they are being taken down the garden path. Issues of the small minority becoming radicalized and violent probably exist prior to any misinformation or disinformation, whatever you define that to be. Because one person's disinformation is another person's truth, and it's complicated. And I think we put too much of a scare sense, panic, if you will, around this without stepping back and saying, and I'll put this bluntly, Trump won the 2016 election not because of the Russians. And that's an excuse that's then dragged out to explain this anomaly, which the elites couldn't understand.
Where I disagree and where I think that we're being complacent is when we look at the type of divides that we are now seeing in society. In other words, there's no question that this has been attempted before. We know that from the Cold War period, but now because of logarithms and the efficiencies of these new systems, I think the divides within Canadian society on the COVID issue alone illustrates that it's not just simply a sort of silent majority in the middle that is always going to get it. We see the divides between families and friends, and it's directly a part of the problem.
Thank you very much for the last question, and you have 2.5 minutes to pose it. Mr. Noor Mohammed, take it away.
Thanks very much. And I know given the brevity of time and recognizing the limitations of the scope of this committee, I do have a question for Dr. Kitchen. Can you spend a little bit of time with us talking about the specific concerns related to misinformation or disinformation and the way in which it is starting to have an impact on Canada, and in particular the ways in which you are seeing it impact action in Canada, and if there are specific ties to international actors, particularly Russia, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Dr. Hubert already gave some of the international examples. We also know that CITE identified international attempts to influence the 2019 election. We've seen individuals who have been inspired by Russian propaganda. For instance, there was a threat to the prime minister. I'm blanking on the date earlier in the year. So I think, but where this is important is the way it interacts with tendencies that are already existing in Canadian society. So for instance, the appeal of COVID misinformation. Where we will see Russia and other international actors acting is in trying to exacerbate those existing social polarizations. So this is a Canadian problem that is exacerbated by foreign interference.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think I may be out of time.
You actually have about 45 seconds.
Oh, okay, very quickly then, Dr. Kitchen, if you could just follow up, where specifically, you talked about COVID as one of the pockets of misinformation. Where are some of these other pockets that you see this really starting to foment? And what are the concerns that you see? What trends are you seeing that concern you?
Certainly the violence that we have seen in the COVID context against Asian Canadians and other minority Canadians, I think we could see that replicated in possibly against Russians in Canada, possibly against Ukrainians in Canada. We could also see various other instances where racialized individuals are being targeted because of the appeal of white supremacy that is in part promoted by Putin's worldview, which is certainly of Russia as the leader of the correct leader of Western civilization that helps to fuel those right-wing extremist groups as well.
Thank you very much. On behalf of members of the committee and indeed on behalf of all parliamentarians, I would like to thank the witnesses. You collectively have literally decades of experience and very deep understanding of the complexities of these issues. And we're very grateful that you have shared your expertise and your insights with us this morning. Colleagues, will now take a short 5-minute break to change panels, and we will resume the meeting. For those who leave now, thank you so much for being a part of this. We'll see you, colleagues, in about 5 minutes. If you could take your seats, colleagues. I will assume everybody is where they're supposed to be. With us this second hour by video conference, Dr. Ahmed Al-Rawi, Assistant Professor, Simon Fraser University. And I would also like to welcome Dr. Alexander Cooley, the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science, Barnard College, Academy Adjunct Faculty at Chatham House, and Dr. David Perry, President, Canadian Global Affairs Institute. There will be up to 5 minutes for opening remarks from our guests, after which we will have 2 rounds of questions. Why don't I begin by inviting Dr. Al-Rawi to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Russian disinformation in Canada has been an ongoing issue, and the Russian government has an ongoing interest in interfering in Canadian politics, using a variety of information operations, propaganda, and disinformation. Using publicly available data sets released a few years ago by Facebook and Twitter, I found that the Russian trolls were the most invested in targeting Canada, far more than Iranian and other state-run trolls from China and Saudi Arabia. These information operations were conducted with the use of carefully concealed social media users, with the assistance of fake websites, as well as news channels like RT, which is Russia Today, and Sputnik. For example, the Internet Research Agency, IRA, created fake Facebook pages and purchased ads often targeting Canadians in 2016 and even earlier. Fake websites that seemed legitimate were also used, like peacedata.net, to spread favorable messages towards Russia. And I also found in 2017, the Russian trolls even promoted a rally in Ottawa against the Liberal government. In my research, the content analysis of social media messages clearly showed that the ideological position of the Russian government aligned well with far-right groups and individuals in Canada. In my view, the main reason behind this information operations strategy is to sow division, create tension, and confuse people about what is real or fake. For example, the main target of Russian trolls were liberals, especially due to their immigration policies, with a focus on attacking Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. The second target is related to Canadian Muslims, with emphasis on visible minority MPs, followed by other targets and issues like refugees, diversity, and multiculturalism. Today, and due to the increasing pressure on traditional social media companies, the public activities of Russian trolls have been relatively curtailed, as there is some scrutiny and general awareness. The same applies to the way Russian state news outlets like RT have been flagged as promoters of disinformation and sometimes banned from operating. However, I personally think that the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission's CRTC decision to ban RT remains only symbolic and ineffective, because RT can be viewed in multiple other ways in Canada and elsewhere. We can see today a different information strategy that uses the Russian government diplomatic missions as its main means to spread propaganda. For example, the Russian embassy in Ottawa runs its own Twitter account, as well as a recent Telegram and VK public channels. The embassy has been active in spreading disinformation and promoting the Russian perspective on the events taking place in Ukraine. Instead of heavily relying on RT or Sputnik, the embassy mostly retweets messages from the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry and other Russian diplomatic accounts and missions from around the world, as well as Russia's foreign allies like China. Also, the embassy frequently posts statements attacking Canadian officials as well as national news media for what it views as biased attitudes towards the war in Ukraine. Any factual reporting on the war is considered fake news, and the term itself is weaponized by the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry to serve the interest of Putin's regime. One of the most troubling features of this disinformation campaign by the Russian government is related to the weaponization of fact-checking practices. In a recent tweet, the embassy in Ottawa announced the launch of a new website called waronfakes.com, which attempts to give credibility to official Russian propaganda. The website allegedly provides fact-checking services with regard to the war in Ukraine and is offered in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and Chinese, denoting the main targeted groups are non-Russian speaking audiences. Finally, the embassy is trying to create a direct link with the Canadian public that cannot be blocked by the CRTC. For example, the embassy often sends direct messages to Canadians via its Telegram channel and Twitter account. In fact, more than 3,000 Twitter users who retweeted recent messages by the embassy are found to be Canadian users who were further spreading these messages. Though the official and public focus has been on banning RT and Sputnik news channels, the reality is that the Russian embassies are creating their own information ecosystem with the help of fake fact-checking websites like War on Fakes. The official Russian disinformation has evolved today to heavily rely on multiple sources, including the social media outlets of these diplomatic missions.
Thank you very much.
Allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Dr. Cooley to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Sir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to be able to address the committee. I would like to focus my remarks on two distinct groups of global and transnational networks that the war has spotlighted, that I believe reverberate back into Western societies, Canada included, and also pose some significant policy challenges. The first you will have certainly heard of and deliberated about, and that is the group of oligarchs. We have seen oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, targeted with sanctions by the UK, Canada, the EU, and the US. And here we have acknowledged in some ways that a bet we made a long time ago has failed. And that is the idea that if oligarchs had access to Western stock markets and boardrooms and philanthropic types of circles, then their behavior would be moderated and somehow they could influence the Kremlin itself into moderation. We face sort of two challenges with the oligarchs going forward. One is going after their assets and freezing them, and the other one is their reputations. And in both of these areas, we also have to contend with service professionals who work here in the West, in the UK, in the US, and in Canada, who enable both of these processes, who take their money, put them into luxury real estate, purchase shell companies, hide them in complex networks of bank accounts, as well as the PR agencies and the reputation management firms and lobbyists that try to recast them not as politically exposed persons with links to the Kremlin, but rather as global philanthropists, right? And this is a challenge across all of Western societies. The second group perhaps is less on your radar, and so I will focus a little more time on them. And that is this emerging community of new Russian exiles that we see the war has created. Certainly, we have seen a steady stream of opposition and journalists go out of Russia during Vladimir Putin's increasingly authoritarian reign. But the dislocations of the last month are truly striking. And I would focus on three distinct groups here. First, hundreds of journalists are fleeing Russia. They are setting up their own networks and channels. And we already have a number of distinct Russian independent media outlets that operate from abroad, from the Baltic states or vis-a-vis Telegram channels. I believe they should be supported and openly encouraged because they're the only source of Russian language independent media out there. Second, tens of thousands of IT workers, 50 to 70 this month, possibly up to another 70 next month, have fled the country. They are in places like Georgia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, as the Russian government has sanctioned big tech, declared Facebook undesirable. You have seen a flight of qualified IT workers outside of the country too. And then the third group would be hundreds of academics and think tank analysts who have also left the country, who do not want to face the consequences of 15 years in prison of calling out this war, are also exiled in places like Eastern Europe, Istanbul, also looking for new types of affiliations in academic homes. So my sort of suggestion to the committee here is to think about strategies to enhance and strengthen these new networks of exile as they try to promote independent thought and effect as much as they can from outside this sort of disinformation propaganda within the country, and to think about what kinds of policies can be adopted to sort of make us a force multiplier as the Kremlin tries to decouple from the West to ensure that these independent and critical voices can be encouraged from outside of the country.
Thank you very much. I would now like to turn to Dr. Perry. Sir, you have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the members of the committee for the invitation to speak today. The horrific events we're watching unfold in Ukraine are demonstrating that Russia is prepared to employ its modernized military without provocation in ways that are fundamentally anathema to Canadian interests and values, and that we in Canada find difficult to comprehend. In response, we have moved with urgency and ingenuity to help Ukraine defend itself and deter further Russian aggression in Europe by strengthening Eastern Europe's defenses. We should act with similar urgency and ingenuity to ensure that Canada and North America are better defended against potential Russian aggression closer to home. Russia is challenging Canadian and Western interests in multiple places around the world and with many different means, including cyber and disinformation activities. In my comments today, though, I will focus on the impact of Russia's military modernization over the last 2 decades and the increased threat it poses to Canada and the United States and North America. Russian aircraft, ships, and submarines can now carry advanced cruise missiles that could accurately hit targets in North America at long ranges, as can other long-range Russian missiles, including hypersonic glide vehicles. We cannot at present detect and track these threats well enough, nor can we prevent them from damaging targets here in Canada. We need to quickly improve our ability to do both. As a result of the Canada First Defence Strategy in 2008 and Strong Secure and Engaged in 2017, Canada has been progressively improving our ability to defend Canada over time, including through the purchase of a fleet of modern fighter aircraft, aerial refueling tankers, surveillance platforms, and a modern naval fleet. I was happy to hear in the last several weeks that the government is moving to further address the defense of the continent through the modernization of NORAD and continental defense. This will presumably involve a new policy framework and a combination of new equipment, the people to operate it, and new or enhanced infrastructure, training, and the other support required to turn that equipment and those people into useful military capability. Let me offer some suggestions now for how we can turn this long-evolving commitment to act with our American allies to strengthen the defense of the continent into concrete action by focusing on the equipment procurement needed to make that happen. Although some of these elements I think are applicable to the other activities we might want to consider. First, defending Canada must be a priority of government. Successive governments have been improving our ability to defend Canada over the last decades, and we have been discussing the modernization of continental defense for years, but those efforts have not moved ahead with the urgency required. As a result, the pace of implementation has fallen short of expectations, money has gone unspent year after year, and needed equipment projects have been delayed. The war in Ukraine is demonstrating the importance of having a capable modern military at the moment when Russia or any other military power precipitates an international crisis, not when we in Canada can get around to doing it. We need to continue implementing Strong, Secure, Engaged and move forward on the modernization of continental defense with urgency we have not seen recently. Doing so will require that this be made a top priority of the government, set by the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and clearly communicated throughout the Government of Canada and all of its departments and agencies. Second, a bigger defense budget is needed now. Canada's current defense spending plans are insufficient to deal with the threats posed by Russia and other powers like China. Our military, like everyone else, is facing historically high inflation pressures, exacerbated by procurement delays. We also have lingering maintenance and infrastructure deficits, as well as personnel shortfalls. Looking forward, continental defense is an unfunded liability that the 2022 budget must address. Beyond our immediate spending requirements, how much we spend on defense sends a signal to both allies and adversaries of our commitment to our own defense, as well as to international peace and security more broadly. NATO's 2% of GDP spending target is an imperfect measure of allies' contributions to collective defense, but it is one that all allies, including Canada, agreed to meet. If we remain unprepared to reach our alliance spending targets, we should be prepared for our allies and adversaries to question our commitment to defense and international peace and security. Third and finally, more money is required, but more capacity is needed to actually use it. Canada is in the middle of the largest defense recapitalization effort since the Korean War, in large part because we were making up for lost time during the decade and a half following the end of the Cold War, when we invested insufficiently in our forces. Many of the key combat fleets we operate today, including fighters and frigates, were purchased in the 1980s, that last time period where we did spend at a 2% of GDP level. And those assets should have been replaced years ago. But today we're trying to make up for lost time using a procurement workforce that was cut in half in the 1990s and never fully rebuilt. Moving our military modernization forward faster will require an increase in the procurement system's capacity because we have too few people with the right skills at present to manage the projects that are already funded, never mind what may come this Thursday with the additional budget dollars. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, we'll now move into the first round of questions. This is a 6-minute block, and we'll start with Mr. Van Popta. Sir, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us here today and sharing your knowledge for the benefit of this committee and for the Canadian people. Dr. Perry, I'll start with you. In 2018, you told the Foreign Affairs Committee at a hearing that Canada's official position is that the Canadian Arctic is a zone for peace and cooperation. But you added that to increase our chances of us realizing that desirable outcome, we would have to bolster our defenses to better deter Russia. Now, that was 3 or 4 years ago. What would you say today about Canada's defense capability in the face of Russia's naval and air presence in the north?
Thanks for the question. I'd say that in the intervening time, we haven't done enough to actually close the gap that I was talking about back then. We have programs underway. You mentioned a couple of them. We just saw a week ago an announcement about acquiring future fighter aircraft. Those all still remain works in progress, and not enough tangible action has been taken to close that gap. So most of that, the delta between what we can do and what we should be able to do remains in place today, unfortunately.
Good, thank you. Now, I was looking at the mandate letter for the Minister of Defense, Minister Anand, and it says, among many other things, you will maintain a strong contribution to NATO and work with the USA to modernize NORAD. Now, would you characterize our contribution to NATO as strong?
I think our operational contribution to NATO is strong. I think our commitment of personnel and good personnel to what the alliance does has been strong. But I do think that we have fallen well short of our alliance commitments towards burden sharing expressed as a share of our economy that we're devoting to military spending. We have for years been well short of the target of 2% of GDP overall going to the military. And I think that now more than ever, our allies as well as adversaries are taking note of those shortfalls.
Good, thank you. So if we were to increase our military spending to 2% as recommended, as we have agreed to with our NATO allies, what would that look like for the North? Let's say upgrading the North Warning System, which I understand is still 1980s technology.
If we were to move to that threshold of spending, it would allow us to move forward meaningfully with continental defense modernization, which has a number of Arctic elements as part of that, and would allow us to bolster the use and utility of the infrastructure we have up there, the types of assets that we can deploy into our own Arctic, and provide us with a quite significant increase in our ability to defend Canada as part of North America.
What specifically should we be looking for in that vein in the upcoming federal budget when it comes to military spending?
I'd be looking for detail on how the government plans to translate the high-level statement of intent signed in a letter last August with the Secretary of Defense for the United States into specific lines of action to move forward on continental defense, along with the funding plan to make that happen.
Good, thank you. Now, you also stated that there's money that has been allocated but not used, not spent. Now, with the recent announcement about Canada purchasing F-35 fighter jets, is that a step in the right direction? Perhaps you could comment on that.
I think it's absolutely a step in the right direction. I think over successive years, we've had money set aside to buy new fighter aircraft, but because of delays in that project, that money continues to have gone unneeded in the immediate term because we haven't gotten to the point where we can sign a contract. The announcement last week of a new fighter fleet is a much overdue, but much necessary commitment to improve the defense of the country.
Good, thank you. I've heard it said in conversations, and I've read it as well, that there are people in our policy-making community that says, well, in order for the United States to defend itself, it must defend Canada as well. Is that true in the sense that there are those conversations going on? And is it true in the sense that that U.S. must defend itself?
It's a risk, but it's one that is actually a risk to Canada if the United States felt that it was in that particular position. I think it's of much benefit to us, not just for our own security, but our position with our closest ally on the continent we share, to be viewed as a partner in national defense and not as a liability.
And how would you characterize our level of partnership with the United States when it comes to NORAD? Are we okay?
I apologize, but I've lost the audio feed.
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question. Are we coming through?
Dr. Perry, can you hear us?
I'll pass
Doesn't sound like it.
If I could ask another question of another witness, do I still have some time left, Mr. Chair?
You just have just a few seconds, sir, yeah.
Okay, I'll give it back to the chair.
Mr. Nur Mohammed, you're now up. You have a 6-minute block. Whenever you're ready, take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I'd like to echo my colleagues in thanking all of you for being here with us today. Dr. Al-Rawi, I have to admit, well, since our world here at SecUnit does not necessarily allow us to think about defense spending nor defense procurement, I'd like to focus on some of the areas where we do have some responsibility. And I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about some of what you said with respect to the Russian trolls, Dr. Al-Rawi. You talked about their areas of interest right now being around the war. Can you talk about some of the other areas of interest that they are particularly leaning into or curious about?
Well, if you look historically, the Russian trolls have been very much invested in supporting the far right in different countries, not only in Canada, but also in the US and in many places around in Europe. The reason is to definitely create tension. And there is a term called edutainment, which means making people really agitated, but at the same time, entertained. So that's that is done through the use of, for example, funny memes and funny messages, but they are very much militant, aggressive, and often racist. So there is like a pattern you can see. This pattern shows that the Russian trolls usually align themselves with extremes, sometimes even with the far left. But that's the strategy in general. And often the targets will be the minority groups, and especially refugees and immigrants in different countries. So the focus sometimes will be on in the Netherlands and in the USA, but that will be the main issue. I hope I answered your question. Do you want me to focus on today?
Well, you did. I guess maybe we could dig a little bit into that. So you've talked about them being anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee. You mentioned anti-liberal in the last election. Are they just anti, or are they actually doing things to promote other causes? And are they pro certain things that we should be concerned about here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, usually they, as I mentioned, they promote far-right groups. Sometimes they don't show like a lot of animosity towards conservative figures and politicians, but that kind of animosity is usually shown against liberals and NDP figures. But that's their strategy. Again, it's about what aligns with their own worldview, what aligns with what they want to achieve, and it could it actually echoes with what Putin has in terms of his policies inside and outside Russia. So it makes a lot of sense. For instance, when they talk about the white helmets in Syria, they consider it a terrorist group because the white helmets is actually trying to undermine the Russian efforts in Syria by documenting human rights violations and so on. And they do this with the help of allies as well as friends from the region and elsewhere.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Rawi. My next question really is for you, but also I'd like, once you're done, for Dr. Cooley to weigh in. You know, we had seen a lot of the impact of Russian misinformation in the lead up to January 6th and in January 6th in the United States. There were clear links and support for what was happening with the QAnon movement. There was a very successful attempt by Russian bots to try and tie what happened on January 6th to Antifa. There is evidence in the January 6th reports that show that there was a pro-Trump effort on the part of Russian bots. And Harvard Law School professor Yochai Benkler said that the primary goal of Russian propaganda is to, quote, create a world where nothing is true and everything is possible. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, the impact on Canada, and whether or not Canada needs to worry about those trends that we're seeing in the January 6th uprising in the U.S. And I'd like Dr. Cooley also to weigh in on that once you're done, sir.
I think, yeah, we definitely need to be concerned because the goal is to confuse people and make their vision of reality blurred in a way that they will not understand what is right and what is wrong, what is real and what is fake. And this is very concerning. And this is definitely related to what goes on in Ukraine in terms of also COVID-19 and so on. Like I can talk a lot, but I think maybe Dr. Cooley wants to also to add here.
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with that. I think from the Russian worldview, there's a sort of an outside world, which is this drive towards multipolarism, right? Not having the liberal West dominate the international system, having spheres of influence. But there's a domestic internal component with that, and that is breaking down consensus for this kind of movement to sort of, collective liberalism, whether it's like NATO, support for sort of transnational kind of cooperative solutions, respect for sort of human rights and liberal values. So anytime they can poke holes in that, either by exacerbating partisanship or political polarization, or targeting vulnerable communities, they will do that. And I want to emphasize this. The goal is not to make Russia look better. Right? That's not. It really is to try and show what they think are contradictions and weak points in our own messaging and our own societal debates, and take that from being a strength to somehow being a weakness of our own domestic institutions.
So, Dr. Cooley, if I could just ask you to follow up, can you talk a little bit about having
10 seconds.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to give my time back. Thank you so much to both of you, for all of you, for your time.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask Ms. Michaud to take her 6-minute block, please, whenever you're ready.
Merci,
Ms.
Monsieur.
Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for their presentations. Dr. Al-Rawi, social media, disinformation, and communication. I'd like to ask you a few questions about those issues. In your opinion, what is the influence of Russian disinformation on the Canadian people? We know that different means are used to do this disinformation, manipulated photos, conspiracy theories. We know that this is used a lot in social media and it has been related to the vaccination mandates, COVID-19, and also what's happening in Ukraine right now. What is the influence of this, and what is the impact of this? I believe you're on mute.
My apologies. In terms of the actual impact of disinformation on the population, it's a really difficult question to answer because I don't think anyone has quantified that or fully understood this kind of influence. But there are indications of the impact of disinformation on Canadians. For example, we saw some kind of violence against the Ukrainian diasporic community in Canada. And this is a clear indication or evidence of the influence of Russian disinformation or whatever if you want to call it propaganda on certain communities. And if you look outside Canada, I'm seeing very worrying signs about the outreach of Russian disinformation. For example, when I looked at Arabic language disinformation spread by the Russian government on social media, I was really so widespread, so overreaching in so many places in the Middle East. Our problem in here is that we mostly focus on English and French in Canada. We forget that we have millions of people who do not only speak these languages, they speak other languages. So I think this is a major gap that we have in our understanding of the real influence of Russian disinformation on our diasporic communities. I think there is a very direct connection, but we miss a lot. These are all like gaps in our understanding, unfortunately. But there are clear indications that a lot of people got influenced. And we also have some people who are replicating this kind of disinformation. One example is Global Research, which is a so-called news organization based in Montreal that is only echoing the Putin's propaganda on its website.
Thank you. And I'm trying to understand how the government can intervene to protect the population against such disinformation. Perhaps we could do something to deal with RT and Sputnik. Would this be a way to protect vulnerable population against this movement that is under Putin's guidance? I know what Canada did with RT. I don't know if the European Union went as far as we did. Would that have a positive impact on the people?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will need to say here that, banning RT, as I mentioned in my speech, might not be fully effective. The reason is because RT could be viewed in different ways through TV apps, the internet, and so on. I think if anyone wants to view RT, it's there, and I don't think it's the only source. So, as I said in my speech, the Russian government is now using its own diplomatic missions to spread disinformation, using these fake websites and so on. So they are trying to create another information source because the focus has been on banning RT. That now they are looking at producing more disinformation from other places. I think the best way to protect Canadians from this kind of disinformation is by debunking, by fact-checking anything that is related to Canada or Canadians in relation to the war on Ukraine. We cannot catch up with what the Russian government and its allies are doing. It's really hard to do so, unless, of course, there is some kind of collaboration between Canada and other countries. But what we can do is debunk what is related to us so that we can better protect Canadians, especially if something is related to what happens inside Canada or within the diasporic community living in Canada.
Thank you. It's so difficult for citizens to separate truth from what's false. I know that Canada does deal with dealing with the disinformation. There's CSC. There are campaigns out there saying that you have to fact check your sources. But in addition to that, what role can the government play in order to help citizens distinguish between what is true and what is not?
I mean, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, it will sound like self-serving, but I think we need. I mean, academics need more funding to run maybe research projects, fact-checking, in an ongoing way. These,
Thank you.
Types of campaigns.
Thank you. I now would like to turn to Mr. McGregor. Sir, you have a 6-minute block of questions whenever you're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Dr. Al-Rawi. In your opening statement, when you were talking about the role that Russian diplomatic posts in Canada have in spreading disinformation, it's always very tricky when dealing with diplomatic outposts because, of course, we have to be concerned about reciprocal actions against our own diplomatic missions, particularly in Russia. Do you feel that we are effectively countering the Russian embassy's role in spreading disinformation currently? Like, is there a heightened awareness of what they're doing, or do you feel that our committee could make recommendations for further countermeasures from the Canadian government?
With regard, Mr. Chair, with regard to the Russian mission?
The Russian missions and diplomatic posts in Canada and their role in spreading disinformation.
I think, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think because of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, I think it's important to at least flag these efforts and, talk about what the Russian embassy is doing in the public domain. I've already written a piece that I hope will be published soon in the Conversation website. So I think we can, like, the only thing we can do, I believe we cannot ban what is going on, but at least flag what is happening and debunk, fact check these claims, and at least warn Canadians not to be enticed or drawn to this type of propaganda.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cooley, I'd like to turn to you. In your opening remarks, when you were talking about the new Russian exiles, journalists, IT workers, academics, and you were asking an open question of how we enhance and strengthen these networks. The expression that came to mind when, as you were speaking, was that the best defense is a good offense, and if we are strengthening these groups to learn more about how Russian society functions, the different power structures that sustain Putin, and possibly launching counteroffensives, I'd just like to invite you to maybe further expand on that subject, because I know 5 minutes is not a lot of time in your opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, the presence of Russian exile media is not new. It's just being magnified now because of this sort of afflux. So we've had very effective Russian investigative reporters doing work on, Putin's corruption, holding investigations in Yevgeny Prigozhin, what he's been doing in Africa. Dossier, Project, these places that are based overseas expose some of the most devastating inner secrets. And in fact, a New York Times Pulitzer-winning report on Prigozhin had much of the same information that these Russian exile reporters reported months before. So I think, first of all, we can support them, right? We can support them financially. Groups like Medusa, like Nexta, let's not leave Belarus out of here. And they've been so key in mobilizing against Lukashenko. Certainly TV Rain, that is now shut down in Russia and is just operating from outside. That's one. And B, we have to anticipate what's going to be at some point the Russian reaction to this, which is to engage in more transnational repression. And I'll just say here, transnational repression is the kind of systematic targeting of political opponents, journalism, civil society, business community of co-nationals sort of overseas. And actually, this use of disinformation against diasporic communities, that's one aspect of this. It could also be actual attempts at assassination or renditions or coercion, intimidation of family members. So the Russians are going to have a real problem because they're going to see all of these communities, right, increasingly engaged to break down this information wall, and they are likely to target them. And so we need to be aware of how we can protect them, not only by supporting them, but also realizing the status that these exiles and diasporas have as communities of interest of the Kremlin.
Thank you, Dr. Cooley, and I'd invite you're always welcome to send the committee a submission if you want to go into further detail on some of the specifics. So I'd invite you to do that. Final question to Mr. David Perry. Our committee's mandate is very much on national security and public safety within the borders of Canada. So I don't want to get caught up on the military side of things. But when you look at, our cybersecurity, the role that CSE plays under national defense, but also CSIS and the RCMP under Public Safety Canada, do you have recommendations as to whether Canada needs a way to reorganize how those agencies function? Anything pertinent that this committee can make as a recommendation to the Government of Canada?
Thank you. I would say that I think that there's a lot of room to expand our collaboration between the government and private sector. And I think that we should have an ability to leverage what is a real national strength in our cybersecurity and high-tech sector and try and find a better synergy between the too much of a siloed approach that we have right now. So more collaboration, I think, would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair. I'll send the 10 seconds back to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Then I'll move right into the second round of questioning and invite Ms. Dancho to begin a 5-minute round.
Thank you,
Floor is
Mr.
yours.
Chair. I'd like to thank you to the witnesses for being here. And my questions are for Mr. Perry concerning procurement. We hear a lot of difficulties of getting money sort of out the door in DND. And there's been a lot of promises made to buy frigates and planes and various defensive capabilities for Canada in order to defend itself against any sort of threat posed by Russia or other state actors. I'm just wanting you to comment on how critical is it that we fix procurement, and how would you recommend we go about doing so?
So I think it's fundamental because that's the way that we basically obtain our ability to respond, whether or not that's for defense specifically or many of the other aspects of national security. You certainly need good human capital, but fundamentally those people need tools, and the procurement system is the way that we give them the tools to do their jobs, whether that's airplanes, ships, or computer systems. There's a whole range of issues with our procurement system, but I think fundamentally, to the point of my opening remarks, we need to decide how important this is to us. Is procuring this type of equipment, is gaining this kind of a capability, again, whether it's for defense or other agencies in the national security community, is it something that matters to us? And if so, how much relative to all the many other priorities of government? That's part one. Part two, we need to calibrate, I think, better what we're doing with the workforce and the amount of work required to do it against the human capital available to us. You need resources, both financial and human, to get all this done. And I don't think that that match has been calibrated appropriately for about a decade and a half now. And until we fix that, we can't really expect to see much of a different result, which, to be fair, successive governments have increased how much we are spending on this kind of procurement, and that's gone up progressively over the last 15 years. We're now spending more money on this than we have at any point by my math since basically the Korean War, if you adjust for inflation. The problem, though, is that we took a decade and a half off doing any of this. So the requirements to just basically catch back up to a status quo level are far in excess of what they would have been if we could stick to a more regular spending pattern over time. Beyond that, there's a whole number of other issues with procurement system, from conflicting government priorities, some of the institutional structure, but I'll stop there.
If you can elaborate a little bit on making the commitment to improve procurement, because again, we're hearing a lot about this, and I'm just trying to understand for Canadians what exactly that means. The government sort of is it sort of like a signal they need to send within cabinet or to the public? How would the Prime Minister communicate that procurement and improving it is a priority?
So I think that there's two broad ways through written formal statements or speeches, but also commitments of time. I think you could point to examples, and the Indigenous file has been one where the current Prime Minister has indicated that file very much matters to his government. And I don't think it's any accident that we've seen spending on that particular file over the last several years effectively double, which is a remarkable increase in a short amount of time. Talking about huge increase in the financial commitment to that particular file. That was clearly communicated to all ministers in the 2015 mandate letters and remains in those in the current version of those mandate letters today. If we want to see an equivalent type of change in output or outcomes on the procurement file or defense national security writ large, you need to see that type of a commitment of government to identify that as a key set of activities and a key set of priorities that they're looking to see progress on. Absent that, the system, the procurement officials, other officials, other department agencies will take their cue that other things simply matter more and focus there first.
In the upcoming budget, what are you looking to see on the procurement side? From what you're sharing, it sounds like we need not only investment in the tools to defend Canadian territory and the Canadian people, but also the human resources in the procurement area. So are you looking in the upcoming budget for a direct indication that this government is investing more in procurement human resources?
I'd like to see an indication of whatever new financial level we potentially move to in terms of defense spending, with presumably a big component of that being oriented around procurement, given some of the needs that have been articulated for continental defense and the modernization of NORAD. If we want to see that money move out the door in, say, a short number of years rather than multiple decades, you need to actually make a commitment to increase and provide the capacity to ensure that those funds actually get spent by the end of each fiscal year. Otherwise, they won't.
And a good indicator to do that would be, it sounds like from what you're saying, a very strong indicator from the Prime Minister, whether in mandate letters to all cabinet or in their general communications, that procurement must be a top priority. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's critical to identify that as a key priority of the government going forward.
Thank you very much. Oh, Mr. Chair, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Ms. Damoff, over to you for a 5-minute line of questioning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you to all three of our witnesses. My first question is for Dr. Al-Rawi. We've talked about disinformation on social media, but we haven't really touched on platforms that aren't quite as common as Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And I'm thinking of platforms like Telegram and Gab, where they're positioned to appeal to extremist or fringe discussions. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the impact of that in terms of Russian interference, and also if there are any recommendations you could make to the government on these less well-known platforms.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so a few years ago, a few figures in the United States and elsewhere were deplatformed from mainstream social media like Facebook and Twitter, including former President Trump and many conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones and so on. This actually led to what they call migration to new alternative outlets, including the ones you mentioned, Telegram, Discord, and a few other ones. Some of them, unfortunately, are even based in Canada. So what we have today is platforms that are dominated by conspiracy and theories and disinformation. So in my study about, for example, the convoy protests, we found that Twitter was Twitter contained very little conspiracies in relation to the protest, but we found the dominant discourses or the conspiracies actually are elsewhere, like Telegram specifically. The major problem that I am seeing is that the big search engines like Google have indexed Telegram. So when I search, for instance, a message posted by Alex Jones on Telegram, I can actually find it. So I think that's the major problem. I do not think we can moderate these smaller platforms, because the more you do, it's like playing the whack-a-mole game. The more you try to silence one of them, 4 others will emerge, because this is a thriving business for them. They are actually profiting probably billions of dollars, not maybe millions, billions of dollars. So I don't think there is a way to completely stop these smaller social media platforms. But what we can do probably is to pressure the big search engines to less index these sites, so that searching for specific content.
And so that would be due with the algorithms that they use as well. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. Time is limited at the committee. Professor Cooley, I have a question for you. You were recently quoted in a Hill Times article talking about how we need to move beyond sanctions of financial facilitators of Russia and target Western proxies of Russian funding. I'm wondering if you could talk about how these Russian proxies and management firms that provide their services to Russian elites, how these firms are influencing cybersecurity, and what recommendations you would make to the government in terms of dealing with that influence.
How they're influencing cybersecurity.
Or, I mean, you wanted them sanctioned, and or national security, I guess. Like, what is it? Is there
national security? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I think what we've had prior to the war is sort of the compartmentalization of issues in 2 streams. One, we used to think about national security issues in terms of kind of classic objectives in foreign policy. And the other one was sort of the realm of domestic politics, or when we talked about kleptocracy or counter kleptocracy, it was very much viewed as a sort of niche governance issue. And now we've seen how the 2 relate to each other, right? And so the question isn't just the specific oligarchs to go after who have ties to the Kremlin, like Abramovich or Usmanov or Sechin or Deripaska, these individuals. It's rather looking at our own professional industries. How is it that we have industries in terms of real estate brokers, lawyers, shell company providers, reputation management firms that perfectly legally can offer these services, which all amount to the same thing, anonymizing the source of this wealth, right, in a manner that is legal and turning it into property or social capital, right, that enhances the status and standing of these oligarchs. That's not just a Russian oligarch. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Ms. Michaud for a 2.5-minute block. The floor is yours when you want to take it.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Cooley, with your knowledge of Russia, do you think that Canada is prepared to deal with these intimidation or meddling activities coming from Russia in 2020? We took issues with respect to cybersecurity. We know that some states are prepositioning themselves in Canada to intimidate people. So what is the probability, given the situation in Ukraine, that Russia will voluntarily or involuntarily damage our infrastructure?
I would say the probability is high. The more groups of exiles or diasporas that exist in a particular country or community that are viewed as oppositional to the sending authoritarian country, the greater the likelihood of digital surveillance, digital intimidation, and then actual physical intimidation. This isn't just a Russian issue. You have experience of this, for example, with Chinese agents, right, operating within Canadian territory too. This is, a broader phenomenon of sort of the extraterritorial reach of authoritarians and how information technology enables that. So I do think making sure that these particular diasporas, these particular vulnerable groups understand, their own role here, the sort of digital citizenship involved. But I think for sure you can expect that the transnational dimension here will become another battlefield for Russia. It has been for the last 10 years.
C'est particulièrement inquiétant quand même.
That's very concerning. Is Canada ready to deal with this, with threats against individuals and institutions? Is our system up to date?
I think it's something that you probably are in a better position to answer than I am regarding Canada. I do think that getting all different kinds of agencies on the same page to realize it's a national security issue should be the priority here. And that includes
Thank you very much.
Asylum hearings and
yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'd now like to move to Mr. McGregor. Sir, you have 2.5 minutes. Whenever you want the floor, it's yours.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Cooley, I'd like to continue on the subject of the Western agencies and individuals that have sort of provided perfectly legal aid to Russian oligarchs, so that they can manage their assets here in a perfectly legal way. The way they've used Canadian law to set up shell companies. They've invested significantly in real estate. I know the UK probably has a much deeper problem with that than we do, but Canada is not immune to that. There was a pledge in the last election to set up a federal financial crimes agency, and the Minister of Public Safety's mandate letter instructs him to speed up work to establish a dedicated unit to investigate this. If you wanted to take your minute and a half, can you expand on the financial aspect of this issue that we're looking at? And does that in any way link to Canada's national security? Like, is this something that our committee should be focusing on when we make recommendations to the government? I think you're on mute, Dr. Cooley.
Please forgive me. I do believe it does influence national security, and especially because we've seen the outsized influence that so-called oligarchs or politically important persons with this extreme wealth have, right? They can influence certain political party positions. They can influence certain national campaigns. Through media contacts, they can set certain agendas. And of course, they can intimidate reporters to prevent them from looking into their own origins of wealth. I actually think the move to a kind of a federal beneficial ownership registry is an absolute national security requirement. And whether this is 2025, 2023, it should happen as soon as possible. I think every country needs to know what are the anonymous shell companies, who's behind them that are buying luxury real estate, but also other assets, right? So I think anytime you put the norm of privacy and my client's privacy against transparency,
thank you.
I think in this age, I think you're on the losing side.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cut the last two speakers to 2 minutes each, which will take us inside the extra time that the clerk has been able to negotiate for us. So, Mr. Lloyd, take 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this unexpected time. My question is going to be for Professor Cooley. Talking a lot about misinformation. Wondering if you're aware of, and you could comment on the well-documented misinformation campaign in the 2021 federal election.
Sorry, which election?
The last federal election. 2021 federal
election. Last federal election in Canada. No, that's not my area of expertise.
Or Mr. Al-Rawi, because there was a social media, I forget, WeChat, I believe it was. Is this another tool that's being used that is of concern for misinformation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I was with Dr. Cooley about the attempts of foreign states to influence immigrant or diasporic groups in Canada. This has been an ongoing issue. So the WeChat thing is there. Definitely there is a clear evidence and indication that the Chinese government has been and is still trying to influence the Chinese community living in Vancouver and elsewhere. The same applies to the other states. For example, the Iranian government is very active in doing the same thing regarding the Iranian communities living here in Canada. So this is an ongoing issue, and they usually target or make use of specific tools or let's say forums or means.
Can you give us some examples of how that worked out in the 2021 federal election from your experience?
In the 2021 election, the WeChat was a clear sign of this kind of interference. And there are so many other gaps that we really do not really fully understand. One thing that I really like to highlight is the importance of studying ethnic Canadian media. So, for example...
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we don't have more time. Mr. Zuberi, you have 2 minutes to take us to the end of this panel. Take the 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'd like to start with Dr. Al-Rawi. You spoke about Russian bots and misinformation. Can you let us know if there were were the bots trying to advantage any individuals or advantage any issues or disadvantage any issues aside from what you already did discuss and share with us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I assume the question is about today, right? The
Yes.
disinformation happening today. Thank you very much. Now, scientifically, I mean, I cannot prove that these are bots because these bots are automated accounts. What I have seen is that some kind of organic users, which means real users spreading propaganda. Most of the propaganda that I have seen so far about the war on Ukraine are related to supporting the position of the Russian government and, of course, sending a lot of what we call, confusing messages. So again, to blur our idea of what is happening and confuse people, and And I think they are really on top of the game because they are very fast in making this kind of disinformation and spreading it. Unfortunately, we are late.
Can I ask if the disinformation is both English and French and in any other languages aside from those two?
I have seen with regard to the Russian diplomatic mission, it's mostly in English, but definitely there is evidence that it's in French. And I've never looked at the Telegram channel of War on Fakes. They have a huge Telegram channel, which is now one of the most popular in Russia. So now the target will be also.
In the last 45 seconds that are left, what are the impacts of disinformation? You mentioned diversity, inclusion, refugees, Muslims, others. What's the impacts, or the real impacts on these communities for the disinformation campaigns you mentioned?
It's actually 10 seconds, please.
Trying to make people mistrust what is legitimate. Multiculturalism included.
Thank you very much. That completes the time that's available, and then a little bit more than that. I would like to thank, on the committee's behalf, the witnesses for a fascinating hour and change. A very complex and important set of questions and subjects. So with that, I would seek permission of the committee to adjourn the meeting. I think I have it. This meeting is now adjourned. We'll see everybody on Thursday morning. Witnesses, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Bye-bye. 12.